Rand Brown is a fourth-year PhD student in psychological sciences at Rice University. Her research focuses on the biological mechanisms through which psychological stress, such as bereavement and spousal caregiving, dysregulates the immune, autonomic, and endocrine systems. You can read more about Rand's work at her website at randlynbrown.com. And I actually also encourage you very much to follow her Twitter account and to see her Psychom TikTok clips. And probably also she has a TikTok account which I'm not aware of, where the videos come from. And her presentation title is Grief, Inflammation, and Depression. Rand, the floor is yours.
I'll talk to you about grief, inflammation, and depression today, but I want to give you a more real-world example sort of what we think about when we're thinking about grief and its effects. So first, as I was saying, June Cash died, and just 4 months later, her husband, Johnny Cash, who's a famous country singer, died as well. And that's sort of the pattern that we often see, where one spouse passes away, and then soon after that, usually within the first 6 months, and it's not that this always occurs, right? But there are these patterns where we see that this does occur sometimes. And so we are studying bereavement within this context. So we, through Project Heart, recruit bereaved spouses and control spouses who have not lost a spouse. And we follow them for a year after bereavement. So today I'll be talking to you about just visit 1, so about 3 months after the death of their spouse. And at each of these visits, we have about 3 to 6 hours of assessments, including blood draws, heart rate variability measures, etc. And the reason, like I was saying, that we focus on bereavement is because it's a highly stressful life event that a lot of older adults experience. And it's associated with an excess risk of mortality, like I said, primarily from cardiovascular disease and primarily in the first 6 months. But it's tricky, right? Because grief symptoms are normal. We see sadness, longing, intense separation, distress, shock, and denial of the death. And that is a normal progression of grief. But at a certain point, grief symptoms can persist to become disabling for people to go through their daily lives. So, for example, some people will experience excessive worry, avoidance, or extreme rumination that persists for at least 6 months following the death of their spouse. And these are associated, these more severe grief symptoms are associated with higher chances of developing cancer, higher systolic blood pressure, changed eating habits, and heart trouble. So really you have this large stressor that disrupts both social, biological, and psychological mechanisms within our body and within how we regulate ourselves in our lives, right? So the change in eating habits is one big one that we focus on as well. But here I'm going to focus more on predictors of cardiovascular trouble because that's what we're really interested in. And that's because inflammation is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And we've recently shown that this inflammation can maybe be distilled by how severe people's grief symptoms are. And so that's what I'll talk to you more about today. But inflammation, we index through pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are associated with greater risk for a whole host of diseases. But we are primarily focused here on cardiovascular disease. And chronic stress can exacerbate the normal age-related increases in pro-inflammatory cytokines. So that means that older adults might be especially vulnerable to these negative inflammation-induced health outcomes. So the first hypothesis of our study was that those who met the cutoff for severe grief symptoms at 3 months after the loss of their spouse would have greater levels of inflammation than people who did not meet the criteria for severe grief symptoms 3 months after the death. So to be clear, we do have in this study both bereaved and control spouses that we've done previous work comparing. But here I'm just going to focus on the bereaved sample and predicting who within this bereaved sample will have worse outcomes following the death of their spouse. So more about the sample, as you might expect, it's largely older adults. I believe the average age is 68 years. And it's largely women as well. And let me go back to that really quick. So as I said, it was 3 months since passing, and on average, it was right there at 84 days. So that's another important piece that we really controlled for and took into account, was actually how many days since the passing of that spouse. So like I said, I'm gonna go through this pretty quick because we only got 10 minutes here. So if you have any questions or more questions about methods or measures, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or anywhere else you can find me. So here we're looking at grief severity predicting inflammation. And specifically, we're looking at a composite of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And the reason we do this composite is so that we don't, is to avoid type 1 errors, so that we're not testing individually like all 5 of these cytokines in multiple different ways, right? Because that's a lot of tests. So we first pool them together and do this composite. And we found that, yes, this composite was significant, as was, once we broke it down, 3 of the specific pro-inflammatory cytokines that we're interested in. And I say that because IL-6 especially has been associated with cardiovascular disease progression in the past. And this is especially notable because we also controlled for and adjusted for age, BMI, gender, medication use, education, days since death, comorbidities, depression, sleep disturbances, and physical activity. So after seeing that, we still see that people who are grieving more severely have more inflammation, and not just more inflammation at rest. What we do is we actually stimulate T cells to see how many cytokines T cells will produce under conditions of stress or infection. So it's a much more representative test of how our bodies are going to respond, how our immune system is going to respond under conditions of stress. So then let me show you, just break it down for each cytokine. You can see this CGC just means more severe grief symptoms, and non-CGC means less severe grief symptoms. So you can see that for IL-6, TNF alpha, and interferon gamma, each of these is just one of the pro-inflammatory cytokines of interest, that we saw that more severe grief symptoms were associated with elevated inflammation. And here that actually means that the T cells were producing more cytokines. So you might ask about depression, right? Because grief and depression are pretty similar in a lot of ways. So we also looked at depression here. And we found something pretty similar, where depressive symptoms predicted similar cytokines, and that makes sense based on prior literature. And again, this is really interesting because we haven't had any kind of studies that are looking at bereaved spouses, and especially looking at this highly stressed time point, because you might expect that there would be a ceiling effect, right, for depressive symptoms and inflammation. But what we found is that even people who were experiencing higher levels of depressive symptoms had that linear relationship with inflammation. So the more depressive symptoms, the more inflammation on average we found. So overall, our findings reinforce the role of inflammation in negative health outcomes, and this novel finding that grief severity is associated with higher inflammation, and that can't be explained by depressive symptoms. So there's more work to be done to distill sort of the differences in grief and depression in that time after bereavement and what they represent. There's also more work to be done to see, are grief symptoms causing more are grief symptoms causing more inflammation, or is inflammation causing depression, right? Because this was a cross-sectional analysis at 3 months. So we're really looking forward to when we can analyze more data across the entire year to see which is predicting which over time. Because there's a lot of question in our literature and health psychology about, does depression predict inflammation, or does inflammation predict depression? And similarly with grief, we want to understand which direction that's going in. And so lastly, I'll just say that it was very notable that the pro-inflammatory cytokines that were related to severe grief symptoms are ones that we found from past studies that might be particularly sensitive to the rumination, so that persistent kind of thought that characterizes severe grief symptoms oftentimes. And with that, I'll just say thank you to our lab. We have an incredible lab, and also to Dr. Fagundes and Heinen, who have spearheaded this whole project. And big thanks to Danny and Ido for organizing this incredible virtual conference. And if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me on social media. I'm more than happy, and I like absolutely love talking about this research, so definitely happy to talk about anything you are interested in. Thank you.